Yes, I studied Emily Oster's parenting newsletter. So who is Emily Oster? She is a professor of economics at Brown University, and she's also a public intellectual. So she's been on NPR, written for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, but she's probably best known for her three popular press books about parenting and pregnancy. All three of these are New York Times bestsellers. And in February of 2020, she decided to launch a parenting newsletter to stay better connected with her readers. That's what I studied, but before I get into that, let me provide some context to the ideology of parenting in the US. Intensive mothering is the dominant ideology right now. It is child-centered, very expensive, very time-consuming, but it's also supposed to be a source of great meaning and happiness, especially for mothers. One of the ways it differs from previous norms for parenting is that it's expert-driven. So for instance, in the Victorian era, mothers were believed to be naturally warm and they could just follow their instincts to parent, but now parents are told you need to get expert advice. So what sort of advice do parents get? It's a huge industry and there's no consensus. So even as recently as the 1960s, there were figures like Dr. Spock who were widely trusted and revered, and now the field has really fragmented. Two of the ways that that this advice does stand out is that, rejection of instinct and folk wisdom. It's not good enough to do what your parents did or your grandparents did. Instead, there's a focus on psychology and how children feel. And what that leads to is a focus on the emotional regulation of parents. So this puts a lot of emphasis on small decision making. Everything is important: what you feed your child, how you teach them how to sleep, how you display your emotions, suppressing certain emotions like anger and sadness, and it's a tremendous amount of work. So this is the landscape that parents were in when COVID-19 happened. And COVID-19 was especially stressful for parents because school closed, childcare centers closed. Even 9 months after the pandemic began in the US, more than a quarter of parents said that their childcare centers were still closed. So this was a long time period where parents had to make tough choices about exposure, childcare, stress of home life boundaries collapsing. So I really wanted to look at what kind of advice parents were receiving during this time. Emily Oster's newsletter, the beginning of it is the exact beginning of the pandemic in the US. So I looked at the first 6 months, 58 issues, about 75,000 words. One of the more popular issues was viewed over 500,000 times. She was also writing for mass media outlets during this time. So I used critical rhetorical criticism, and 5 main themes emerged. I'm going to focus on just 3 of them really briefly. The first is she advocated for process-centered decision-making. So she didn't tell people what to do, which is very unusual in the parenting advice genre. Generally, parenting advice will tell you this is our theory of childhood or our theory of development. And based on that theory, you must do X or you cannot do Y, or else terrible things will happen to you or your children. She really avoided that framing by focusing on how parents could make rational decisions on their own. Even when parents were begging her to tell them what to do, she really stayed firm to this. I cannot tell you what to do because everyone is different. They have different values, different risks. Everyone's unique and there's no perfect answers. So instead, you have to make your own decisions using the process. So she was very, very into rational decision making. At the same time, she did acknowledge strong emotions. She talked about crying in her car at the Whole Foods parking lot and expressing sadness, anger, and mental exhaustion. She gave parents permission to feel those feelings as well. But what's most notable is what was not in any of the issues. She never talked about how to talk about the pandemic with your children, how to restrain yourself or avoid strong emotions in front of them, or how to deal with their emotions. So she really, she did, it was very unique for the parenting genre, I'll say that. The third one I wanted to really briefly touch on was collective action. So because of her emphasis on decision-making and rational individualized choices, I thought that she might be overly individualistic. But in fact, she consistently called for collective action in regards to the pandemic. So social distancing, mass data collection, universal or random testing, and reopening of schools are a few examples. This makes sense. Pandemics are inherently social, and there's only so much that parents can control. Again, this is different from intensive parenting, which puts parents, puts all the responsibility of parenting and child outcomes on the feet of the parents, and specifically the mothers. So overall, I argued that Oster's take is a useful counterbalance to intensive parenting during a very stressful time for parents. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that she's most useful for parents who have the luxury of options. So for parents who are essential workers or single parents, they may not have had many decisions to make because they didn't have many choices. So her focus on decision making would not be as useful to them. If you want to learn more about intensive parenting, parental determinism, and Emily Oster, this is going to be in the January issue of Women's Studies and Communication, or you can always email me or tweet me. Thank you so much.